welcome. We're going to be doing a session today on perfect. That's great. My name's Adeline. I'm from Families and Beyond, and we're here with Judy as well from Hope. And today we're both going to be sharing with you some more information regarding harnessing the power of the vagus nerve and also looking at primitive reflexes. Hi, Judy. So we're going to get going, if that's okay with everybody. We're going to spend some time sharing. I'm going to talk a little bit about primitive reflexes and the role in child development. And Judy's going to talk a bit more about the vagus nerve and that impact on child development and regulation. And then afterwards, we're going to leave some open time. So people, please feel free to either share questions in the chat box or raise your hands and come online if you want to ask us questions. And we'll do our best to answer as much as we can. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to try sharing my screen and hopefully you'll all be able to see it and we'll get going with the session. Okay, bear with me. Technology is not my strong point. Okay, I hope everybody can see this. And let me come back to the beginning. So hopefully this is everybody can see. So as I mentioned, this is a collaboration between Families and Beyond and Hope AMC. And we've worked collaboratively over many years to support children and families in terms of development. Hope offers some amazing services in their clinic for families and children with a huge variety of ways in which they can support. And Families and Beyond, we are more focused as a home healthcare, and we also offer support from a neurological perspective in terms of supporting children and families in development. So together we have a great support of each other, and we hope between the two services that we can offer as much holistic care of families and children as you grow and as you navigate these journeys together. So getting started, primitive reflexes and development. I don't know if people know much about primitive reflexes, but these are the reflexes that babies are born with. They're really important for the most basic, essential parts of development. So they're involuntary movements, they're automatic, they're not something that needs a huge amount of control, and they're there for the most basic and primitive functions. So, for example, it includes when a baby first suckles, when they go to the breast or they go to the bottle, that first primitive reflex when you stroke their cheek and they open their mouth and they turn towards their source of food. Even things like grabbing at things, their startle reflex, turning their head, moving their body, some of the most basic primitive movements that you see on newborn babies. This is what primitive reflexes are, and they're there for a reason. They're there to help with survival, and they're there to help with the most basic functions that a baby needs to keep themselves safe and to get their most basic needs met in terms of nutrition and safety and attachment to their primary caregiver. So these are the basics of what primitive reflexes are, and a little later on I'll go through just a couple of them to give you a bit more of an idea. And why do they matter? Well, like we said, they matter because it's really important for essential survival, and they build the foundation of brain development. So it's the very early, most basic primitive movements that are needed later for when your little ones start sitting up independently and they start crawling, walking, talking, writing, and all those more advanced skills that they then develop as they go through their childhood. Now, primitive reflexes are there mainly during the first year of life, although some do extend a little further than that. Some of the primitive reflexes can fade away after just the first few months, and others stay there for a little bit longer, depending on what the reflex is. And again, we'll talk through that a little bit later on in the presentation. But these primitive reflexes are there to have the most basic form of movement, the most basic needs. And then when they fade away, they give way to more complex processes that are required as your baby, as your child grows and develops. And they have to establish some more complex processes in terms of their development. When we talk about the development that a child goes through from birth until even just 2 years of life, it's immense what that child achieves in that time, from being totally dependent on their caregiver for every aspect of living, to at 2 years old often being fairly independent and being able to move around, to self-feed, to communicate. So this is where primitive reflexes come in. There's so many reasons why reflexes don't always integrate the way that we would expect them to. And when reflexes don't integrate or don't fade away, then this is where sometimes we can see different signs and symptoms, which we'll go on to a little bit later in some of the presentation a bit further on. But some of the reasons why reflexes don't always integrate fully can be things like prenatal stress or difficulty in birth. Maybe the baby had a little bit of a difficult birth, a C-section delivery, if there was some trauma at birth. Maybe they needed to be admitted to the neonatal unit. They had, maybe they needed oxygen therapy or feeding therapies. And sometimes these can interfere with the natural progression of reflexes, which is why some reflexes remain there after a difficult birth, and they don't fade away the way we would expect as they grow older. Sometimes as well, it can be a developmental delay or a neurological immaturity, meaning that the child's brain and body needed a little bit more time to go through those developmental stages, especially if they'd had a difficult time in utero, in pregnancy, and then in delivery and onwards. Sometimes as well, it can be from not having as much exposure to things like tummy time, crawling, free play. They haven't been able to move around as much or explore the world as much. And sometimes it can be due to some stresses or traumas in those early years, early months, that can impact how the body regulates when we look at the nervous system. And I'm sure that this is something that Judy is going to go on to explain a little bit later on in the presentation. So there's so many different reasons. And when we're looking at reasons why the primitive reflexes that we're born with that should fade away at different stages in development don't, there are many reasons. And it's not that your child failed to reach that reason. It's just maybe there's been something that has interfered in that natural progress or that natural process. And then that's something where we can support with that in helping your child catch up on those areas that they've missed, to integrate or to fade away those primitive reflexes to allow more complex processes. If primitive reflexes are retained, then the infant reflexes, if they don't fade away, allowing those more complex movements and processes. You can see it sometimes in behavior. It can impact things like focus and attention. It can impact motor skills, both the small movements, fine motor, and gross motor, those big movements as well. It can also impact emotional regulation, how your child feels, if they get startled easily, if they feel anxious easily. So certain reflexes, if they don't progress or fade away, then they can really impact on so many different areas of sensory processing, emotional regulation, focus and attention. And these are some of the key symptoms that parents come to us with. Things that you might notice. Now, all children, we expect in the processes of development that they're never going to perfect a single movement or a single process or developmental milestone right away. But if you find that your child is continually a messy eater, they really struggle to get the food into their mouth, to coordinate their hands, their eye, their mouth movements and coordination. If they're quite picky with clothing. They really dislike certain textures and fabrics and tags. These can be signs that some of the reflexes have been retained. If they struggle to sit still, if they're the kids that, when they reach school age are really struggling to sit for more than a moment in a chair, and they fidget and they get really frustrated. Sometimes retained reflexes can also impact potty training in the child's ability to feel the feelings of fullness when their bladder is full and needs emptying. It can also look like challenges in writing, in how they're holding their pen or their pencil, their grip, their reading, and their speech as well. And sometimes it can be a sensory processing, in terms of, get startled easily by loud noises and dislike certain sounds and dislike certain textures. Often, with eating, that's a key sign when children struggle with certain textures. And sometimes as well, like you mentioned earlier, being easily overwhelmed or anxious beyond what you would expect for their developmental age. So I think it'd be helpful now if I show you some of the reflexes so that you get some context for what we were just talking about in terms of what happens when certain reflexes that a baby is born with don't fade away. So the rooting reflex, we mentioned this at the very beginning. This is the reflex that I think is something that everybody will be aware of. When you stroke your baby's cheek with either the bottle or the nipple, they turn their head to latch and to feed. Now, this should fade away around somewhere between 4 to 6 months. You start to see it fading away. But if it's retained, if you have a child that's maybe 2 years old and they still have a strong rooting reflex and it hasn't faded away, this is sometimes how it will look in terms of, like we mentioned, messy eating, that they struggle to coordinate their mouth movements, their tongue movements, their hands, their spoon to their mouth, or their finger food to their mouth. Sometimes it can be hypersensitivity around the mouth. They really don't like different textures, different feelings on their mouth. And you often find that they gravitate towards one certain type of food. Sometimes it can look like speech difficulties as well. Difficulty in being able to pronounce words, to articulate, to get that movement of their mouth. And like I mentioned, linked to the messy eating side of things, the poor hand-to-mouth coordination. They struggle to coordinate those fine, more complex processes that is involved in picking up something and bringing it to your mouth in an accurate manner or an accurate way. Because like mentioned earlier, primitive reflexes are the most basic movements that should fade away to allow more complex processes. And if they don't, this is what it could look like. So this is the rooting reflex. Another reflex that I think you'll all remember or you'll all see in your children or family members is with a baby. When you put your finger in their hands, they naturally grasp onto it and they hold on tight to your finger. And again, this is a very primitive reflex. It's there. Originally, it's thought that it was there so that babies remain attached to their primary caregiver. They can hold on to their mother. But again, as the child gets older, as they develop, this reflex should really fade away, because it's something that by around 12 to 13 months, they should be able to manage some more fine movement of their hands and their fingers. And if the palmar reflex hasn't faded away, then often we see these in the children that have started school and they're struggling with their handwriting or pencil grip. Sometimes, their hand gets stiff and sore when they're writing or drawing. And sometimes they struggle with fine motor tasks like doing up their buttons, using scissors, tying laces. And all of these things, as much as they're important for their fine motor skills, they also play a bigger picture in your child's confidence and independence. Because when they start school, there is an expectation that they can do up their buttons on their trousers when they're going to the toilet, or when they're getting dressed for PE, they can change into their sports shoes and do their laces up or do their Velcro clasps up. So all of these reflexes, as much as we're talking about kind of the most basic movements, they also lead on to some really important achievements in terms of independence and confidence, and for your child to be able to do certain things for themselves at different stages in their life. The next one, and I'm just giving you an example of a few. This is no means the entire list of reflexes, but I'm just giving you a few so you have an idea of what primitive reflexes look like and what some of them are. But there's the STNR, symmetrical tonic neck reflex. And you can see here with this image of a baby crawling, this reflex is triggered when a baby moves their head up or down. And the purpose of this reflex is to help with the baby's movement when they're getting from their tummy, when they're able to roll, when they're able to push themselves up into all fours to be able to crawl. And crawling is such an important developmental milestone in terms of brain function and development. And sometimes if this reflex is retained, you'll see it. Sometimes these are the children that sit in that W position where they have their knees bent backwards and they're struggling to stabilize their core. Sometimes they can have difficulty in moving between sitting and standing. They can look a little clumsy, a little off balance. Sometimes a little bit slouched in their posture. And sometimes it can also impact things like handwriting and reading and focus. Sometimes children with retained STNRs are children that write lopsided and their writing kind of angles up the page. So these are some of the things you might see. And the last one we're going to talk about before we move on is spinal galant. This is a reflex on the baby's back. And this often emerges during the birthing process when the baby is turning down the birth canal. Now, if this is retained, then often you find these are the children that find it really hard to sit still. They're very sensitive around their back area. They're very sensitive to different materials on their t-shirts, to tags and labels. Sometimes it can also look like bedwetting. There are many reasons for bedwetting past the age of development that you would expect a child to wet the bed at night time. But sometimes a retained spinal galant can be one of the reasons why, especially with that sensitivity around their lower back region. And this is another one that we can check for. And you can easily check it on your child just by using the back of your fingers or the back of a round pen to stroke up their back and see how much they twitch or react to it. Some children, the minute you go next to them to run your finger up their back, they do quite a exaggerated movement of "get off me," that's not comfortable, and that shows that there's a strong spinal galant reflex there. So what's the answer to retain primitive reflexes? Well, the reason we think, and the research shows us, that retained primitive reflexes are really important, it has a lot to do with how our brain develops. Our brain is literally built from the bottom up. When you look at a brain, when you look at the anatomy and physiology of a brain, it is literally built from the bottom up. And if you can see on this picture here, you've got the pink area, the brainstem, which is responsible for a lot of the central nervous system, you know, our heart rate, our breathing, our temperature. And then as you start to go up, you've got the cerebellum, which is balance, coordination. And then you kind of move up to this green and yellow area, which is our temporal lobe, you know, our hearing, our learning, our feelings. And we've got the occipital lobe here in the green, which is vision and color and perception. And then the parietal lobe is the blue, which is language, touch. And then one of the last things to develop is this red area at the front, the frontal lobe, which has a lot to do with thinking, speaking, memory, movement. And this goes on to develop right through our teenage years. Now, the reason why it's important to understand how the brain develops and what it develops at different ages is because, like anything, when you're building a house, you have to build strong foundations. You're not going to start adding the roof before you've laid the strong foundation, the strong first floor, then the second floor, then you'll add the roof. It's the same with primitive reflexes. Primitive reflexes are part of the most basic elements of the foundation of building the brain. So the primitive reflexes that we have, if they don't fade away, then they don't allow those more complex next stages of development that helps build the brain up. So this is why it's really important to consider the primitive reflexes in terms of how our brain develops and how our brain is functioning. And if some of those primitive reflexes didn't fade away, then we need to go back and we need to almost kind of fill in the gaps of this strong foundation to make sure then going forward, any other support, therapies and things that we do to help are being built on strong foundations at the most fundamental primitive approach. So things we can do to help. We can look at how our brain hemispheres, our right and our left hemisphere of our brain, how they're working together. And if one is overriding the other, we need to have a look at how can we balance that. And we can do that through many activities to stimulate different regions of the brain. We can also have a look at integrating primitive reflexes, and that's done through a lot of different physical exercises that are quite simple to do, but are important to do consistently, at least a few times a week for several weeks to start to integrate them. And we can also look at how by integrating these primitive reflexes, we can address some symptoms that often appear in different neurodivergent disorders or conditions such as ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia. Some of the primitive reflexes and the symptoms that you see, even through what we've just talked about, can often be seen in some of the symptoms of different neurodivergent conditions. And so this is why helping integrate these primitive reflexes can really reduce symptoms and make a really big difference in terms of development and next stages of your child's development. Things that you can do at home, lots of physical activities, as much floor time as possible if you have a young baby. And if you have an older child, as much time in the park, on the swing, climbing, things like pinpoints, these kind of activities where your child is having to climb and crawl and jump and, any kind of these activities that gets their body moving across that midline. Doing animal walks, this kind of thing can really help. And I'm sure everybody's very aware of screen time and limiting that. Screen time in this day is inevitable, but just reducing it so that your child is having more opportunity to move and engage in the world around them. Because when they're focused on screen time, then they're not using all of their senses, they're not using their body, and they're not engaging in the world around them. So that's why limiting screen time in that perspective can really help. Looking at diet and nutrition, unfortunately, in the modern world, our diets are probably not what they should be. So we need to look at how we can increase whole foods, reduce sugars, artificial additives, ultra processed foods, and also having a look at our, allergies and tolerances to make sure that we're supporting the brain development, the gut-brain relationship as much as possible. And looking at consistent sensory routines. So what this means is daily sensory input, touch, movement, sounds, and how we can rewire the brain. So thinking of things like doing deep pressure for your child, if you do like joint compressions, or swinging, spinning, movements that are stimulating their senses and giving them a sensory outlet as well. And then, of course, if this is something that you wanted to explore further, then you're very welcome to come and speak with us at Families and Beyond, and we can do an assessment to check your children's primitive reflexes, if any are retained, and then from there help you develop a plan on how we can integrate those reflexes through different physical movements and stimulations, which will help fade away those primitive reflexes and allow more complex processes to occur. Okay, I think we have come to the end of this section. I have tried to keep it to time as much as possible. So I'm wondering now if Miss Judy, if you'd like to take over, and then at the end we'll allow a bit of time for question and answers. Thank you.
It will help if I put my microphone on. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Adeline. Yes, we've come quite a long journey. Let me just open this so long. Just give me a moment. Okay. I'm like Adeline said, I'm also not very sharp with all the tech. So luckily we've got great support here at Hope. Karen is always with us. So yes, I think the interesting thing, as Adeline was speaking, when working with children, I think what makes it so interesting to some of us, children can't really explain to us what's happening for them. So I always feel the more knowledge we have, the more tools we have, the more options we can use to support the child and the family. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the vagus nerve, and I'm sure many of you know about the vagus nerve, there's a lot of talk about it lately. And like what Adeline was referring to, it's also part of the primitive systems of the brains and has like a bottom-up influence on the top functions. I'm so happy to have seen that diagram. I didn't put mine in today, but I always have that diagram in my presentations of the building blocks of how children learn and develop, like Adeline referred to. Okay, the vagus nerve in 1995, this man, Dr. Stephen Porges, he suggested the polyvagal theory. And he was saying, when you work with children, a child only has one question. They are obsessed with one question, and that is, am I safe? And based on that, this theory developed over the years. So when we look at this, it's no silly question, but it is the basis of social engagement, of thriving, of learning. So what does the vagus nerve do? It's often referred to as the wandering nerve because it is the longest, the biggest nerve in the body. It's also part of the cranial nerves. And those are the nerves who goes directly from the brain to the body. Now, they're not like our voluntary muscles are supplied by nerves that go via the brain to the spinal cord, to the muscles. And as you can see, this vagus nerve is more or less involved in everything, in your facial muscles. It signals to other people how approachable you are. Your heart rate is regulated by it. Your digestive system is regulated. Your immune functions, your breathing functions, your voice, there's branches going to your vocal cords, to your muscles that you use for speech. And then also it's in direct contact with the thalamus, which is one of the primitive areas of the brain that is in charge of our mood. So please, if you can just note that all the organs it supplies is at the front of your body. Then I also want to think of the communication between the brain and the body as kind of highways of communication running up and down. And like Adeline was also talking about the primitive nature of the reflexes, this is also a primitive function that lies here in the primitive areas of the brain that has a really major impact on how we live. So if we look at the nervous system in a different way, we're talking about the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And then we talk about the peripheral nervous system. And there it's the cranial nerves. Like we said, the brain's going directly from the brain to the organs, like the eye, the ear, your tongue. And then there's also the spinal nerves going from the spinal cord towards the joints and muscles. And part of the peripheral nervous system is what we call the autonomic nervous system. So the other part of it is called the somatic nervous system, where we can control things. So I can control to pick up this glass, I can give the information to my muscles and do it voluntary, but I'm not in control of my heart rate, of how my kidneys are working or my liver. So that's the autonomic nervous system. And then previously we thought of the autonomic nervous system to have two parts, parasympathetic and sympathetic. And this is where Stephen Paul just said, yes, that's true. The autonomic nervous system is sympathetic and parasympathetic. And when we talk about the sympathetic nervous system, the way you will know this is when we talk about fight and flight. Okay, that very useful system that the body has to know I'm in danger, I need to prepare myself to get away. But what he said is the parasympathetic system, unlike what they previously thought that it's only the rest and digest, he said no, now we have three areas. We have the fight and flight, we have the rest and digest, and then we have the freeze, or they also refer to the state of overwhelm. So what's the implication of this? When a child has that question of, am I safe or not? Can I come out or not? It's not the child's imagination. It's not something we can tell the child, just get out of it. It's actually the nervous system responding to a few things that we're going to look into. So the polyvagal theory is working on three primary principles. The one is saying it's hierarchical in nature. The other one is saying there's neuroception, and the last one is co-regulation. We're going to look at those. So when we say the vagus nerve and the autonomic nervous system is working in a hierarchical way, the nicest way for me to look at this is this little ladder that Deb Dana developed. And when you're at the top of the ladder, you are in that state of rest and digest, you feel safe, you feel socially engaged, you're ready to learn. But when you move down in the ladder, you mobilize, you get agitated, so you move down into the fight and flight part, and then you can really go down to the bottom of the ladder where you are numb and collapsed and shut down. So another way of looking at this is which platform is the brain on to prepare itself to engage with life and with the world. So I think all of us, whether you're a parent or a teacher or working with children in another way, when you see this child, I think you will agree with me, this is not the optimal state. The platform this child is on is probably that middle platform of being agitated. Okay, when we move to the second principle of neuroception, and I want to read this with you. Neuroception is distinct or different from perception. It is detection without awareness. It is the subconscious process whereby the nervous system, through processing sensory information, then works out via neural circuits if a person or experience is safe, dangerous, or life-threatening. So it's not just the child, it's the child's internal visceral state, or what's happening in the child's body, is how the child is interacted with. It's the adult nervous system or the other nervous systems around the child, and it's the events that's happening in the environment. A nice way for me again to look at this is this picture, because I often explain it like you've got an internal radar system that picks up unconsciously, and that makes your nervous system respond to the environment. Okay, so we had hierarchic, we had neuroception, your internal radar, and the third principle is co-regulation. And this is how the nervous system connects with others. It's an interpersonal experience of warmth, connection with others, where we use our voice, our face, eyes, ears, facial expression, gestures to help them know they are seen, heard, or accepted. And it's reciprocal. It allows for the capacity to self-regulate and manage our own response. That's very important. And it's an essential component to survive and thrive. And yes, there's a lot of research in that area to say, but it's really essential. Okay, so co-regulation, looks like this. Whether again, it doesn't really matter where you are working with children, but when a child is, say, for example, not well regulated, feeling they're not coping, it always helps to have the adult or another peer there. Here's an important thing. Often as therapists, and like Adeline was also saying, we get referrals for children to regulate themselves better. Here's the secret that the polyvagal theory adds. If we do not allow co-regulation, self-regulation is probably going to be a very tough task for the child. So co-regulation and self-regulation is really very important, a very important factor. Okay, what's the implications of all of this for us as teachers, as therapists? And I'm sorry, I haven't even explained to you, but I'm an occupational therapist. I'm all the clinical coordinator of the therapy team here at Hope. So as parents, as therapists, as teachers, what does this mean to all of us? So I think the one thing we have to remember, the one implication is that this hierarchical system is dynamic, and it's also hierarchical in the way that if I move from the position of feeling safe to mobilize, to shut down, I can't jump back to safe immediately. I'm going to move step by step up and down the ladder. So it's very important for us to be aware, what does the ladder look like, so that we can check the child's neural state regulation or platform from where they engage in the world. And also it's a dynamic system. We're going to come back to that quickly again. But the fact that I'm now in the safe mode doesn't mean I'm going to be in the safe mode when I have a car accident, maybe, God forbid, later. But it's a dynamic thing. All of us are moving up and down the ladder. It doesn't mean if I'm safe today, I'm going to be safe for the rest of the week. Then the implication of the neuroception, this is quite an important thing. When this neural state experience of the child is that I'm not safe, it's not something you can work through on a cognitive level. We can't use those high functional structures like reasoning, communication, cognition to say to them, don't worry, you're okay. If that's their bodily experience, it's a very true experience for them. The other thing, the co-regulation, is very important. What the implication of that is also is us as adults working with the children or parenting children, we also need to make sure that we are in a well-regulated state. We need to know, where am I on that ladder of self-regulation? Okay, and then self or social engagement and communication. So this is what Dr. Stephen Porges is saying. If you are not at the top of the ladder, social engagement is not a priority for you. The moment you go down onto the ladder, if you're in the middle of the ladder, you're into the fight and flight or mobilization mode, your focus is going to be survival. When you're or protection, sorry, and when you're at the bottom of the ladder, your focus is going to be survival. So the implication of where you are on the ladder is social engagement and communication. And as you know, we often work with children who struggle to socially communicate or even engage with others. So again, it's very similar things. If the vagus nerve is not well regulated, very similar things to what Adeline noted, difficulties with eating, sleeping, attached to the parent, irritable with activities of daily living, doesn't want to play with toys with others, resists to be held, cannot calm themselves, floppy, can't move properly. There's behavioral difficulties, attention, emotional difficulties, social relationships are a challenge. And then also poor self-regulation, mood swings, limitations when they participate in school and other community activities, and poor self-esteem. So what do we do? How do we help the children? So Dr. Porges also developed a therapeutic tool or a therapeutic modality, which is called the Safe and Sound Protocol. And for that also, we would rather suggest an occupational therapy consultation, because it has to be used by a certified therapist. and it's a very specific tool that we need to individualize according to the child's need. But then there are other things. How do we do this? The one thing that really made a difference in the world of development, of learning, of social interaction is what Dr. Stephen Porges said. The brain is a social organ. It needs another brain. He said the best gift you can give to anyone is to be accessible to them or for them. It's that co-regulation. And when we work with children, I always like to mention the highly sensitive child, because it's a normal variety that about 20% of children have more sensitive nervous systems. They are more receptive to the cues coming from inside, outside, from other people, or what's happening in their environment. And then sociality is a new term I hear Dr. Porges is using, where he's really saying that thing of engagement, being at the top of the ladder, is really something that strengthens or that supports your vagus nerve to stay at the top, or your autonomic nervous system to stay at the top of the ladder. And then another thing that can help is when you look at a child's behavior, you must think neural state regulation, or on which platform is this brain that's in front of you, and think of the ladder. The ladder is almost the easiest way to visualize. Where's this little one on the ladder? Because behavior isn't only what we see on the inside, it's also a neurological process happening on the outside. Then it's so interesting. A lot of the things that Adeline noted in what can we do is very similar to what we can do to support the vagus nerve. And some of it is things we often do instinctive or intuitively, but it is things like listening to music or singing, humming on your own or with others, dancing or rhythmic movement, sitting on a swing, walking in nature, breathing out, keep the breath out, being with safe people, smiling, laughing, playing, stroking a safe animal, holding a small sleeping animal or a baby, taking a bath, gardening, painting, coloring, rocking, sitting on the floor, lying on the floor with your legs up the wall, or hanging upside down in a way that your head is lower than your heart. Something else to do. Oh, I see I've actually saved another version. So another thing to do is the right here, right now exercise with the child. Like when you see your child really dysregulated, to do the breathing, slow breathing, keep the breath out, and then to say, let's see if we can see 5 things that are blue, or let's see if we can identify 2 things that makes a sound, or let's see if there's something nice that I like to smell. Can I find something nice that I can smell? So that's just one more exercise that we can use. Okay, and there are a few resources. So that I'm also going to stop sharing. And we can see if there are any questions for Adeline or myself? There's no questions yet.
None so far. That was really interesting, Miss Judy. Thank you. I loved how, as well, like you were saying, there's so many of the tools and the things that we use, whether it's primitive reflexes or the vagus nerve, that are so intertwined. And you know, essentially, we're talking about the same regulation and the same neural networks. And you know, so many of these things are tools that help holistically, and it's not just targeting one element. It's not just the primitive reflexes, it's also the vagus nerve and that connection between child and caregiver or parent.
Yes, yes,
interesting.
Yes, yeah, it is indeed very interesting, Adeline, and also what you're saying about that holistic approach. And I really do see, I'm not sure, you know, maybe you see it in your practice, but as an OT, we definitely move from the premise that there's no recipe that works for one child or one nervous system. Even if you use a technique, doesn't matter what it is, you have to adjust it to that individual nervous system. And maybe it shifts something, but not everything. And then the teamwork is such a beneficial thing.
Definitely, like you said, there's not, you know, like with anything, we're all individuals, every child, every family, every circumstance. And we have all of these tools that we can use, but we have to find what is the right thing for that child. And that's what sometimes can take a bit of time. And not just for the child, like you mentioned, for us as adults, sometimes it's really hard when children are dysregulated to be that regulated person to meet them. So often we find as we start exploring challenges that our children face, it often brings up many things that for us as adults we face. And then we go on a journey together where we're working not only on supporting our child, but also ourselves so that we can be that regulated person.
Yes, absolutely agree. It does inevitably make you as a caregiver ask yourself questions, or as a parent. And I don't think that's a bad exercise. It's actually quite a good exercise because it brings the potential of growth and development and progress.
And that can be really helpful for children to see as well within, you know, within the appropriate context. It can be good for them to see that you can identify and understand that, yeah, you feel frustrated, me too sometimes. And, you know,
exactly.
So they don't feel quite so isolated in their feelings and emotions.
Absolutely. Totally agree, especially in the world we live in where everything looks so perfect.
Yeah, so especially when we're talking about our older kids, when they start accessing things like social media and, you know, that peer pressure when they get higher at school and they get into the older age groups. So there's one lady, I think Kushbo, who's asking, can we share any YouTube or video links? But I'm wondering, maybe Kushbo, some suggestions would be like Miss Judy mentioned about Stephen Porges. I'm sure if you go onto YouTube and type in his name, or if you type in primitive reflex information, there's a wealth of fantastic videos from around the world. And I guess, like with anything, just be cautious on what you click on and see where it comes from.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you have any good websites or recommendations, Judy.
Well, the Polyvagal Institute is basically the institute of Dr. Stephen Porges. Grounded Grown Ups is also a nice one. But actually, we are going, Hope usually do place the webinars on our YouTube channel, so it will be available. I think that's what Karen is going to help us with.
I'm just typing that in the chat now, so that we should both can see that as well.
Thank you.
That's great.
Yeah.
And I think like with anything, one of the benefits of technology now and all these resources we have is that you can search far and wide and you can get a lot of information out there. But then the downside is you just have to be a little cautious about where the sources are from and just make sure that it's a source that seems to be well researched and evidence-based. But the great thing is there are so many podcasts, webinars, and information. So I think as parents, you can kind of get quite a lot of information out there, which can be a good thing and not so good because sometimes it can feel overwhelming. But I guess if you're looking in the right areas, you can get some really valid information to support.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a question, one more question saying, are there specific classroom-friendly strategies to help students or ourselves regulate through the vagus nerve activation? So I'm guessing this is in a school environment if the students are becoming dysregulated or indeed the teachers and caregivers.
You know, they are actually, and I went on a school visit for a boy I was seeing, and I was so impressed. The teacher, after the break, everybody comes back. They sat on the mat in front of the smart screen, and on the screen she had these visuals of bubbles. You know, different colored bubbles, but there was, I think, one purple, and everybody had to sit quietly for 3 minutes, I think it was. These were grade 1 children, and they were sitting on the carpet and following that bubble quietly, and it was amazing. So I'm sure, again, if you look at strategies for classroom, but any other thing like humming, let's all hum a song that's familiar even for the little ones, or let's all come back and sing a song, or movement, let's all rhythmic movement, let's all move our arms up and down, or turn to your friend, look your friend in the eye, smile and move your arms up and down. So it can really be simple things. We think it needs to be big, but if you think simple, it's it works. Yeah.
And I guess having a variety for different children on what their different needs are.
Yeah.
So like something that incorporates maybe using multiple senses.
Yes, absolutely.
There's another question as well. So the question is, I'd like to know, how can the psychoanalytical approach to listening, inspired by authors such as Francoise Dolto and Sergei Libovici, I hope I pronounced that right, support early intervention that respects the baby's subjectivity? That's a very big question.
Yes, the psychoanalytic approach to listening. So I'm familiar with psychoanalysis, but I'm actually not familiar with this approach.
Caroline, would you be able to give us just a little bit more context to the question? Is it in terms of listening like the safe and sound protocol style that Ms. Judy was talking about, or is it something different? We can always come back.
Yes, I think the one thing that I can say, and I have to say I did this with my own grandchildren if I met them early enough, but to support and respect the baby's subjectivity, if you put your face close to the baby and smiling and vocalizing and actually talking to the baby in a calm, well-modulated voice, the nervous system will immediately respond and reciprocate the engagement. And engagement is viewed as a very respectful act because it's reciprocal.
Communication. And I guess similar like in baby massage and such, where we were always taught, you know, you rub your hands, you present the warmth of your hands to your baby's body before you touch them, to kind of get that permission to be able to then engage in this activity. And if the baby doesn't look comfortable or feel comfortable, then you need to address whatever that need is. Maybe they, you know, they're not comfortable, they're cold, they need whatever their need is, but you don't just plow on ahead because that's what the teachers told you to do. So again, like you said, it's that just respectful boundaries and reciprocal communication of receiving the feedback that the baby's giving you, as well as giving them your kind of regulated, nice smiling face and all the things. You know, it's that reciprocation of that non-verbal communication, I guess.
Yes.
So I guess that would incorporate respecting the baby's subjectivity as well.
Absolutely.
But that looks like a good question. I'm going to look up those specific authors as well.
Yes. Yes.
I wonder if anybody else has any more questions before we wrap up for the day. But if it's something that, okay, I attended a workshop with Dr. Melody DeJagger where she presented massage techniques for vagus nerve. I have had success with neurotypical students, but no success with my ASD students. Is there a link?
Sure, Dr. Melody DeJagger, I think she's a South African. So yes, there are techniques to massage the vagus nerve. I've never used it, and it makes sense to me that it's not going to be working for an ASD student, because we know children who are on the spectrum or who are not neurotypical, we assume that their that their sensory processing is also not typical. So when you do massage of the vagus nerve, the little bit I've seen is that some of it is in the neck, but you know, the A version of touch and maybe pressure and in sensitive areas of the body may be tough for them. So I would work on social engagement. You see, there's also a difference between social engagement and social communication. If the child's not socially engaged with you, if the child's not feeling safe purely being in your presence, in the room, for example, that little girl in the balls, it's one of also her parents gave me permission to use that picture. But I want to say to you, it took me 8 months of treatment to get her to make eye contact with me, but she was hidden in the balls. So it's sometimes with the neurodiverse children, I would suggest work first on social engagement before you work on specific techniques in their body. I would rather maybe go with deep joint compressions that Adeline also referred to. It's a less invasive kind of thing, but that's purely my experience. Dr. Melody may have had a different experience.
I think, like you said, it's the comfort level as well of being touched, and sometimes working on things like even like vibration plates and things like that can be helpful to try and get children used to the sensations around their body and their proprioception and these kind of things that can often be an issue, and to work on that first.
Absolutely. And you know, the approach of Dr. Porges, and it's something that resonates with me as a therapist, is it's worth moving slower in the beginning to get to the point where you can move a bit faster. I think sometimes we're so focused on what we can do that we feel that investment in social engagement isn't worth it, but it's absolutely worth it.
And it takes time, like anything. Like you mentioned, it took you 8 months with the child to feel comfortable for eye contact. But like with anything, when we're talking about brain development specifically, there's, unfortunately, we wish there was a quick fix, but there's not. And it's time and consistency and repetition. And these things, they do take time, and it's not something that can quickly be established. And I think also, like you mentioned, you know, sometimes it's the environmental factors that we're always rushing and under time constraints and pressure. You know, we have to get the child into the uniform, to get them to school, to get them to this, to get them to that. And so even when we are doing tasks that encourage and support social engagement, often they're under time constraints and specific boundaries, which can make it hard to go at the pace that the child needs to go at. And that's hard to find that balance sometimes, because we have to conform to certain restrictions, often set in by schools or whatever, time, traffic, I don't know. But
absolutely.
But that's where it can be hard to get a balance sometimes, can't it? To go at the child's pace, to give them the time that they need to connect, to reset, but also to meet all of your deadlines and restrictions as well.
For sure. So it's maybe also our intention, you know, it is that conscious intention to make more social, or to create more opportunity for social engagement. Otherwise, I think life will just absorb us. So it is about becoming more aware of set the intention to really see, and start small, whether you're working one-on-one or in a classroom or it's your own child. Start with something very simple, very small. It's not necessary.
We don't want to try and fit every, you know, like you mentioned earlier about sensory regulation and such in the classroom, you know, and that individual approach when we're looking at how we can support a child, that not one thing is going to work for everyone. So sometimes, you know, we try to kind of almost fit children and people into boxes of there's certain expectations that every child should be able to sit and to focus and to do this and that in a certain way, but also recognizing everybody's different needs and styles, and not everybody is going to be at the same place at the same time in terms of their development as well. And I think recognizing that individuality and looking at each child holistically.
Absolutely.
We come back to. I think, is there any more questions from anybody, or everybody asked what they felt they needed to ask? I think no. Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Judy. It's always nice working alongside you, and it was very nice that so many of you joined us on this Sunday afternoon. And if you would like further information, then please feel free to reach out to Hope or to Families and Beyond. And we are happy to support you as best we can in any way that we can. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Adeline.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.